Greetings. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online this evening. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and tonight we are here with the author of Mushroom Blues, the Hoffman Report, Book 1, Adrian M. Gibson. Adrian M. Gibson is a Canadian speculative fiction author, podcaster, and illustrator, as well as occasional tattoo artist. He was born in Ontario, Canada, but grew up in British Columbia. He studied English literature and has worked in music journalism, restaurants, tattoo studios, clothing stores, and a bevy of odd jobs. In 2021, he created the SFF Addicts podcast, which he co-hosts with fellow author M.J. Kuhn. The two host in-depth interviews with an array of science fiction and fantasy authors, as well as writing masterclasses. Adrian has a not-so-casual obsession with mushrooms, relishes in the vastness of nature, and is a self-proclaimed child of the mountains. He enjoys cooking, music, video games, politics, and science, as well as reading fiction and comic books. He lives in Ecuador with his wife and sons. I'm going to hand it over to Adrian to read us an excerpt from the forthcoming Mushroom Blues.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on, John Paul. It's great to finally meet you, even though we've had so much correspondence. But I will take it away. This is chapter 12 of Mushroom Blues, Subdued. Spare some scrip? A homeless gilly proffered his grimy hand toward me. I recoiled, almost smacking it away on instinct. The bastard had followed Koji and I for half a block and wouldn't bloody leave us alone. It had taken a while to find a safe place to park the Metro RT. Streets were blocked off by CPAN military trucks, and most were impassable except on foot. This area was hit hard during the Spore War. Ironic, then, that all the refugees from ruined neighboring towns were corralled into this pit of collapsed buildings, mud, and mold. Even then, I hadn't expected it to be this much of a shithole. Come on, guy, the fungal persisted, stumbling beside us. How about a ration card? Fuck off, I said from behind my mask. Even with the heavy CPAN presence here, I kept looking over my shoulder. Part of me was annoyed by this relentless beggar, but I also feared that golden tooth spore sack to lunge out of the shadows at any moment. Koji took a few bills from his pocket and placed them into the beggar's palm. A gift, Juju. The homeless fungal stopped. He bowed so low that his cap grazed the filthy ground. Ariarido, may Matsuo shine bright upon you. As if on cue, a soldier appeared and snatched the bills from the molder's hands. Another soldier came in from the side, striking him in the ribs with the butt of his rifle. The gilly crumpled into a fetal position. Sad sputters of spores fell out of his dirty gills as the two soldiers kicked him again and again. I kept walking. You shouldn't have wasted your money, Nemeko. The muscles in his jaw bunched up. He glanced back at the brutal, senseless beating. Leave it, I said. That's not why we're here. Where's Reishi Temple? Koji sighed. This way. 'Tis not far. We continued down the road, surrounded by destitution. Fungals were passed out on the ground, lying in dirty snow and puddles crusted with ice. It was hard to determine who was sleeping and who was dead. The air reeked of urine, shit, and acrid alcohol. A chill crept through my bones and the foul smells clung to my nostrils. I pinched the metal strip on my mask, securing it to my nose. As we walked, I picked out several rail-thin mums attempting to feed their crying babies from near empty breasts. The distinct squeals and hiccups of the infants dredged up remembrances that I hadn't realized I missed. Sounds that once satisfied my motherly instincts. Now, on a putrid street in the pit, all it did was cause painful memories to resurface. I clenched my mittened fists. Like a fragile flotsam in rough seas, I drowned out those thoughts. The self-loathing, anger, and ego that I bathed in booze for years. I had to concentrate. Koji and I had one goal here. Find Daigoro's mom at Reishi Temple. We followed the piss-stained street, making our way past the dilapidated remains of mold-covered buildings. Micro bricks and debris were strewn about. Rusted bombshells and bullet casings littered the ground. Few solid structures remained in this wasteland. Have you been to the slums before? Koji asked. He pulled out his pack of cigarettes and lit one of those mushroom-tipped cancer sticks. I shook my head. Most of my cases have been in human wards, dealing with human problems. The CCTV network makes things a lot easier, but that doesn't extend beyond the Caprinian Quarter, Central, or the Temple Ring. A lot more difficult to catch criminals without video evidence. In reality, so much of this city was still a mystery to me, most of it unfriendly toward humans. The slums stink of contempt and abandonment, Koji observed. Fungal refugees are the ones who suffer at the hands of Caprinian negligence, despite the victims of a war they did not start. Out of sight, out of mind, and easier to control, Koji mused sullenly, taking a drag. Somehow, though, there was life here. Fruiting bodies sprouted from the collapsed ruins, creeping through cracks and bullet holes. Refugees have lined the street with tents, stalls, and communal spaces, using bombed buildings and wrecked pillars as structural supports. I heard unfamiliar Hopanese dialects coming from various colonies of fungals. Most were dressed in rags and blankets, huddled around burn barrels to warm their extremities. Shroom skewers charred atop the fires of makeshift grills. Icy winds pulled smoke along the street, clouding the air. I wondered what these streets may have looked like before the war, before humans arrived. The pit was a ramshackle mess, but it was also survival born from the necessity to live. Even a species as alien as the fungals were born of the same basic biological instincts. But as foreign as they were to me, I was once again an invader in their world. Most every molder we passed gave me a loathsome look. One old gilly woman spat on my boots and cursed, "Shimin Chabi, colonizer bitch." I moved to act, a desire to punish her flaring up. But Koji stopped me. The wrinkly old spore sack saw my death stare and went back to constructing a lantern, attaching thin paper to a rectangular wooden frame. I noticed dozens of people along the street, adults and children alike, in different stages of assembling lanterns. Cutting mycopaper, building frames, and painting logograms onto the sides with a charcoal and water paste. After a moment, it clicked. The Fuyu Lantern Festival. Despite the destruction wrought upon us, Koji said, exhaling a puff of smoke, we have been given a chance to celebrate. Whatever scarce resources we have, this holds meaning for us. This city, the war, the aftermath. It was like stumbling through the gates of hell and seeing humanity's worst nightmares come to life. Will you celebrate the festival? I asked, genuinely curious. Koji stared intently at a nearby wall. He crushed his cigarette butt into the ground. For many, the festival will serve as a distraction from the truth, but that is not something I can avoid. I followed his gaze. A thick sheet of white mycelium crept up the remains of a mycocrete structure. Strange, colorful mold grew from the mycelium, forming into detailed portraits of children, logograms beneath, missing posters. One after another, I counted young fungal faces, 22 in all. The final portrait was of a little girl whose features were mostly human, save for a handful of fungi sprouting through her hair. A half-breed. My skin prickled at the thought, remembering what Oze had said about Gilly women being raped during the war. Everything I do, Koji said, I do for them. Is Daigoro here? Koji pointed to a poster of a small boy. The moldy depiction showed Daigoro with a serious expression, lips pinched and eyes withdrawn. He had tousled black hair below a plump brown cap. I can see the family resemblance, I said, noting the shapes of Daigoro's button nose and round ears. Something is happening nearby, he interrupted. His gills shook. We must go. And that's it.
Thank you so much for sharing that excerpt with us.
Thank you.
So I'm noticing a picture of Koji on the wall behind you, and of course you're a tattoo artist. I wonder when you're working on building characters for your books, do you often incorporate illustrations in that process? Do you draw them first as you envision them, or do you write them first and then illustrate?
With Koji, I drew him first. But the whole fungal verse, which is the sort of interconnected fictional universe that Mushroom Blues takes place in. It'll have different books and different series that are kind of all interconnected. But it started out with me drawing for the most part, drawing characters, kind of getting a sense of like the fungal people and their biology, but also just kind of like architecture and mood and stuff like that. So it was really fundamental to build out this world at the beginning, where I spent way too much time world building and drawing as opposed to actually writing stuff. But now, looking back, I realize how beneficial that was for me to have that time to kind of let the world breathe and come into its own, and for illustration and visuals to be a part of that.
Um, uh, Maybe this is getting ahead of the game a little bit here, but are there plans for a comic or graphic novel? Because that stuff looks really cool behind you there.
Thank you. Yeah. At some point, I would like to do a Fungal Verse comic. I don't have anything clear in mind yet, but I also have another author friend who has dabbled in comic work, and he and I want to collaborate on something as well.
Very cool. I'd be keen to see that. So, a lot of the world building that you've done in this book, I found was very cleverly done through implied history. The characters' memories and history of the war, character background, such as alcoholism. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about dealing with implied history when writing as a form of world building versus, info dump spelling it all out.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Jonathan Navarre's here with us watching, but he termed it very well. He's one of my early readers, and he used the phrase microdose world building, which is perfectly apt for for Mushroom Blues and anyone who knows psychedelics. But for me, it's just a much more engaging way to absorb information about a world, and even about the real world, just talking to other people and not having them drone on and explain stuff. It's so much more fun and interesting to sprinkle things in through story, and to have conversations and dialogue, and like you said, implied history be the way in which information is delivered. And what that does is it diffuses in the brain in a much less jarring way. Exposition can be done, and obviously there are times where you have to do exposition and a little bit of info dumping, but the important thing is to not take the reader out of the experience. And too heavy handed of exposition is more likely to either make them bored or confused. Like the infamous like fantasy prologues that are just full of too much shit that people don't have any context for. And so it's so much it's so much more rich to be thrown into a world and then have the information delivered to you in a way that is much more subtle and done with tact by the author, such that the reader doesn't notice necessarily that they're absorbing all of this information. But over the course of a story, you realize, holy shit, like I have so much kind of just imaginative exploration that I've done in this world. Even though I've never been in the Spore War, I know something about the Spore War. Or even though I didn't know this character 20 years prior, there's stuff that you figure out about them much in the way humans do through natural conversation. Friends and relationships develop, and we microdose information between one another through genuine conversations as opposed to lectures.
I like that. It comes across well. That's hilarious too, Jonathan. The microdosing information. So when
Yeah.
when you're building your characters in your head or on paper or however you do that before writing, do you sort of build these character profiles with the history, or is this something you figure out as you go?
There's kind of like a baseline that I want to have in mind, but a lot of it is just the character, you know, having the room to breathe through the telling of the story. It's kind of like the most pantsy thing that I do as a writer is have sort of like an established world and sort of basic frameworks for the characters and what they're going to do, but they'll go off and do their own thing half the time and really surprise me. And that's the kind of thing where it's like I hope it gives the reader a more enjoyable experience and more sort of like complex experience and rounded experience because the character feels more, you know, thought out. And there are just so many things like Henrietta, her alcoholism wasn't something that came in until later. That wasn't something that I had in mind at the beginning, or the fact that she's like at the beginning quite racist. And those are things that I kind of honed in on because of the payoff that they deliver later on. So it's kind of like the story's beginning having a conversation with the end, and these things having to be more deeply established in order for that payoff to be more satisfying.
I noticed that a lot of heavy lifting for the world building too also happened between in the dialogue and the way the characters spoke in their xenophobia towards each other's cultures. And I
Mm-hmm.
wondered if you could speak to that as xenophobia as a form of world building, where you can get you really get a sense of how these cultures view each other and the
Mm-hmm.
tension within there.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, you put it well in terms of the xenophobia is a vehicle for characters with difference to pull more out of each other. That difference is the thing that allows them to break down their preconceived notions of the other, and slowly but surely you start to learn more of the truth about both of those cultures. And so for Henrietta and Koji, they're the entire book is like they're playing this, you know, almost good cop bad cop kind of dynamic, but they play off of each other in terms of what they teach one another about Copernican society, which are the humans, and Hoppanese society, which are the fungals. And I was very much inspired by the movie District 9 and how it handled the aliens, the prawns, and how they were discriminated against and they were segregated into ghettos, and the ways in which humans treated them, but then also the ways in which prawns perceived humans. That dynamic is super fascinating to me. And so to be able to do that was kind of like the perfect way to approach the weirdness of mushroom headed people, because it's not, it's not in our world. And so there is this fantastical element to it with these people who are symbiotically merged with mushrooms, and they have mushroom cap heads, and like spores are flying out of their gills and stuff like that. It's very surreal and it's very unsettling in a lot of ways. And so to have that perspective, yeah, MJ saying fruiting bodies, lots of fruiting bodies. Um, to have that perspective and that othering is a way to make the the slow release of information about these characters and the world that they inhabit much more, um, just much more enjoyable. It's like the microdose world building kind of thing. That slow release as you unveil more over time, and the xenophobia is just a perfect vehicle for that, I think.
I noticed too something I found very interesting that I don't see in a lot of books. When the sensory descriptions and your setting, a lot of this was handled through olfactory information.
Mm-hmm.
Very few books remember the power of the nose in this
All
way.
about the nose, man.
um, what made you decide to do it this way? I mean, because it's quite vivid in the fungal verse, it almost brings you into a damp cave. And I wonder if that was
Mm-hmm.
intentional. And how do you decide with your sensory information what weight to put on which sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all about smell. It's one of these strange things because human beings, we don't realize it, but the majority of the information that we perceive is translated through the olfactory system. Our taste, but not only that, the ways in which we perceive other people are affected by the the pheromonal output of that other person, the people that we're attracted to. There are just so many ways in which smell, like sense memory, people don't remember visuals as much as they do smells. One of my oldest memories is from when I was in preschool. And next to my preschool was a river. And I started there in the fall, and that's spawning season for salmon. And so one of my oldest memories is the smell of dead salmon as they gathered in the river and spawned and died. And that smell is so potent. And I think people underestimate how powerful that can be. And especially in fiction, when there is such uh, an imbalance between the different senses, where visual, like sight, is so heavily relied upon. But I think sight gives the basic, the most basic foundation for immersion in a scene. But then once you start building upon that with sound and smell and taste and these different things, it starts to become more and more and more immersive. And so combining all of these things together, but not relying so heavily on sight and starting to incorporate some of the other ones, I think really ups the immersion factor for readers. And for me in particular, with the mushrooms and the sort of like fungal nature of this world, mushrooms are just the kinds of organisms that deserve to be smelled and touched and tasted as much as seen. The slime, the gills, like breaking a mushroom apart and just like feeling all the different parts of it, or in cooking, the ways in which, like matsutake mushrooms like release like a smell like cinnamon, or the ways in which mold sort of like lingers in a space, and you walk into that space and the first thing you think is like, oh, you know but that ugh is exactly what I want to capture. I want people to enter into a fictional room in this book and just be like, ugh, or kind of like experience that gross out factor, because there is a lot of body horror in this book, and fungi are just kind of ripe for that kind of thing. But to be able to combine it with other things like police procedurals allowed me to not rely so heavily on body horror and that kind of thing, and show both the beauty and the unsettling nature of fungi at the same time.
So we're definitely going to be talking more about mushrooms in this conversation. But you said something that I wanted to ask about, the vivid memory of the salmon.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that connected to the mycelium growth in forest floors?
In the sense that, yeah, like decomposing material from rivers, it goes back into the earth, and so mushrooms are the prime decomposers of this planet, and so much of what our world is based on is because of mushrooms. So it's kind of crazy to think that like mushrooms, we know so little about them, even though they're so abundant on our planet and have done so much to alter the the terrain and the ecology and the atmosphere. So much of our atmosphere is due to the fact that mushrooms changed the compositional nature of the soils and the biomes on our planet. Trees and the way that they are able to grow so big is because of their relationship with mushrooms. And that in turn produces more oxygen and gives us the environment that we now live in. And so there are so many ways in which mushrooms have shaped us, but we just don't know it.
Fascinating. So you mentioned police procedurals.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of crime scene investigation in this book, which of course adds to the setting. And I wonder, when it comes to things like investigation and the whole fungal thing, what sort of research processes do you have for this?
Yeah, I think the fungal research is like, it goes way back, so I didn't necessarily have to do anything so specific to this book. It's just something that I've been learning about and reading about for a long time. And so it was fun for me to be able to draw on that well of knowledge and twist it in a way that works for a fictional world. So there is a lot of stuff in Mushroom Blues that is rooted in mycological truths, like facts about mushrooms and the things that they do in order to propagate and reproduce, or the ways in which mycelium interacts with different things. But police procedurals and kind of like the intricacies of investigations was something that I had to put more time into. But I'm also a big fan of police procedurals, like going way back. And so for me, it was also really fun to be able to kind of draw upon the tropes that I really love in that genre, and to be able to kind of lean into them and subvert certain ones as well. And I kind of love the fact that, like, you got a police procedural, there's going to be, like, obviously the crime scene and conversations with the forensics technicians and the crime scene investigators. There's going to be like an autopsy, and there's going to be an interrogation, and there's going to be a conversation with the superior officer, like the captain or whomever. And all those things are just really fun to play around with. And a lot of it, I was thinking, like, how can I bring the unique aspects of this world and the mushrooms in order to subvert or enhance those familiar beats? Like, how can I make an interrogation not just an interrogation? How can I bring fungi into this? Or with the dead bodies, how can I bring fungi into this? um, all of it is just kind of comes back to fungi, and how I could use that in a genre blending way to enhance enhance these well established tropes and beats and frameworks.
Rooted in, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, rooted in mythological truths. I love that. I'm butchering the word.
Mycological.
Mycological truths. I love
Yeah.
that. That's quote of the night. Um, so on top of all that, you've created what is sometimes referred to as a conlag, a constructed language in this
Mm-hmm.
book of Japanese. Can you tell us about the creation of this? How did that work? Did you reach into roots, existing language to do this? How difficult was it to keep track of that as you moved through the book?
Yeah, so it's rooted in three languages. I mean, the world itself is based heavily upon Japan, um, this country that I adore. And, this world and this book is my love letter to Japan, in a way of kind of opening people's eyes a little bit to not only the amazing nature of fungi, but also history, and the ways in which um, colonialism and imperialism have shaped the world. And in terms of the language, I pulled on Japanese and Chinese and Korean, in order to kind of figure out, like, grammatical constructions that would sound real, um, and at the same time not just like pull wholesale from any of those languages. Even though a lot of the names are pulled straight from Japan, Neo Kanoko is new mushroom, Kanoko is mushroom in Japanese. Um, but for me, those world building aspects were kind of like part of my love letter to Japan type mentality. And with the language, it was kind of like, okay, what are some phrases and um, words that would be useful in the context of enriching the world through just little tidbits, like to give people contextual clues that there is something deeper going on here. And at the same time, there's a lot of slang and colloquial language, which also enhances the xenophobia, or the relationships between fungals and humans, in the sense of like slurs and things like that, like, you spore sack. as opposed to just like eufungal, there, or you mold, or just like these ways in which humans could sort of worsen, from the reader's perspective, worsen their perception of the fungal people, or in the sense of like seeing how discriminatory a human is towards the fungal person and the slurs that they use, creating more empathy for the fungal people. So the reader realizes that the fungal people, are they more human than the actual humans themselves? And just using language as a framework to be able to heighten these sorts of facets.
So, I want to talk about more about your obsession with mushrooms. When did this begin? Um, what sort of studies, informal or formal, have you done surrounding this? Um, and does Ecuador have anything special to offer as far as fungus is concerned?
Ooh, yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. Um, so mushrooms is something that I've just been obsessed with for a very long time. But it all stems back to me growing up in British Columbia and exploring the temperate rainforests around where I grew up. So my brother and my friends and I, we go into the forest and we'd have pinecone fights and we hit each other with sticks and just like role play and stuff like that. But we'd also turn over logs and we'd look for bugs and just kind of see what was going on and explore the environment. And mushrooms are always a part of that, especially in a place like British Columbia where there's so much rain and the fungi just thrive in that kind of place. And so I was always picking up mushrooms and breaking them apart and touching them, and it kind of goes back to like the sensory descriptions that I use in the book and the ways in which my real life experience with mushrooms has always been a multi-sensory experience. And then as I got older and started dabbling more in psychedelics, that's when I started to read more about mushrooms and to dive deeper into uh, mycology as a field, the study of mushrooms, and reading books about it. And um, Paul Stamets in particular is one. He's an amateur mycologist who has gone on to have world renown because of his passion for fungi and the ways in which it opened his eyes to what fungi can do for the planet through mycoremediation and through material sciences and engineering and all these different things. And so as I've gotten older, I've just read so much about fungi, whether it's on Wikipedia and the internet, or um, science articles, or books. Like I just have tons of books. Like on my desk, I just have a pile of books, and like half of them are about mushrooms. And it's just, yeah. Cliff is there. Yeah, there's a Star Trek character who's named after Paul Stamets, because in Star Trek, I think it's like Star Trek Discovery, which is the newest one. They have hyperdrive, like a jump drive, that is fungal based. So it's like, it's like a spore mycelium based technology that allows them to jump through space with this warp drive. But yeah, it's just this fascination that I've had for a really long time, and it's carried it's carried through my 20s and into my 30s much stronger, in the sense that I created the fungal verse and I started reading fiction where fungi was involved, with authors like Jeff Vandermeer and his Ambergris trilogy or Annihilation. And even now, like in Ecuador, I'm I'm in a very mycologically rich country where the Amazon jungle in particular, which I've had the pleasure of visiting a handful of times, has, you know, some of the richest diversity of fungi on the planet. You know, there are fungi that are being discovered even to this day in the Amazon. There are species of fungi that in the 1980s, Chevron opened up oil wells in the Amazon here in Ecuador. Um, but they left, and what they left behind was horrible contamination. And years later, it was discovered that there is a particular species of mushrooms that would thrive in that contaminated environment and actually breaks down petroleum into its base molecules and feeds off of it. And that goes back to mycoremediation and the fact that fungi can be used not in every way, not in a blanket term, but it can be used in some ways to help save our planet. And so for me, it's just, yeah, fungi are magical. I love them.
So you brought up psychedelics. I'm assuming it's okay to talk about
You're
this.
in Joshua Tree, of course it is.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I just wanted to make sure you were.
Yeah, yeah, I'm
Of
good.
course, reading the book, it does beg the question, how much of the setting was inspired by tripping through inner space? What's your relationship with psychedelic mushrooms, if you're comfortable talking about that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know for me, psychedelics have brought on a lot of visions that find their way into my science fiction settings too. So I think that's very interesting. And if you could also speak about maybe why these sorts of things can be beneficial for people. Psychedelics have gotten a bad rap for various reasons along the way, but we're discovering more and more the
Mm-hmm.
importance and healing properties of such things.
Yeah, I think healing is the right term. Not just healing, but um, something sort of these dual terms that I use to describe mushroom blues, even though it's wrapped in this veneer of police procedural and whatnot. At the base core of this book, it's about awakening and acceptance. And I think psychedelics, for me, has boiled down to that. Going back to the first time I tried it in university, all the way to today, where I've started incorporating microdosing into sort of my daily life and how I approach things. And I just think the power for organic substances, because they're not drugs in my mind, the potential for them to unlock things in the human consciousness. And I think that's a main reason why, the drug war and institutions and governments found these substances to be so disconcerting, is the fact that it could be used to awaken a population to the truths that institutions prescribe, and through these psychedelics, people could begin to realize how false all of that is. And so in Mushroom Blues, with Henrietta in particular, her journey is very much inspired by my experiences with psychedelics and the ways in which she starts out in the story being a product of her country and her culture, discriminatory towards fungal people, averse to them, disgusted by them. She's even mycophobic. And these are things that, through her interactions with Koji and through her experiences over the course of the book, are slowly broken down, much in the way that a psychedelic experience allows you to dissolve your ego and your sense of self to the point where you're able to be an outside observer of you as an entity. And through that observation, be able to determine, what am I doing with my life? Who am I? What are these things that I call truths? And is that even true? Or has someone else been selling that to me? And so for Henrietta, over the course of this book, she is just worn down, and she warms up to Koji, and she warms up to fungals and the fact that these are living, breathing beings, and realizing how so much of her life is based in falsehoods. And so psychedelics for me, it's it's kind of about this duality between truth and lies, and the ways in which truth is is like a bitter pill at the beginning, but it's sweet at the end, and lies are sweet at the beginning and bitter at the end. And so it's, what are you able to sustain Do you want truth where you have to deal with the challenge, but that challenge leads you towards betterment and optimism? Or do you want the lie where you're convinced in the beginning by the sweetness of it, but then you realize that life is just it's just incomprehensible, and it's so unwieldy that you'd rather take the prescriptions of a government or an institution over your own sense of awareness and control.
The powers that be definitely do not want their consensus reality messed with. Um, Interestingly, psychedelics are good at combating that, but science fiction as well. A place where we can dream other realities. I don't know if you've ever
Yeah.
read the Philip K. Dick story, "The Faith of Our Fathers,"
No, I
but
love Philip K. Dick, but I have not read that one.
oh, you'll have to check it out. It's about psychedelics that turn off consensus
So much
reality.
about his work is about psychedelics. But yes.
Well, once you've been there, it's hard to come back, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so you did another wonderful thing with this book that's really cool. It's been done before, but not particularly often. You worked with the band Sporer to create a soundtrack for
Hmm.
the album.
Yeah.
I think Jonathan had told me they call it Sporecore, which
Oh my God, I love that, John.
it is really great, and the music is wonderful. I've dropped a link in the chat there where you can pre-order the album and preview a few of the tracks. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about working with this band. If they're from Sweden, if I remember
Hmm.
correctly,
Yeah.
how that worked, what the exchange was like back and forth, and just the introduction of music into a book in general.
Yeah. Um, I'll touch on the last bit first because you were asking me earlier about smell and sort of approaching senses from a more um, conscious and purposeful manner. And the music for me is kind of an extension of that, in the sense that reading a book for me is just so much more than text on a page. There are visual elements that I've infused into Mushroom Blues. For anyone who gets, even the ebook has graphics in it. But then on top of that, the music thing is just something that I love. Like, I used to be a music journalist, and concerts and festivals and all of that stuff is very much a part of me and my history. And when I lived in Berlin, um, back in 2015, I met a Swedish guy, Felix, who is now one half of Spore, and we just became very good friends. And we hit it off, and he and I actually spent a lot of our time in Berlin, or not just Berlin. Like, we would travel to other places around Europe and do psychedelics and just see the world and open our minds to as much as possible. And I think music is it is an it is another avenue through which human beings can um, absorb emotion and atmosphere. And I think for a book to have an album to go along with it is just so, it's not super rare, but I think it's one of those things that people just don't necessarily think about that often. And so for me, it was kind of this cool idea to be like, okay, how can I make this a sort of uh, multi-dimensional experience? This visual element with graphics and whatnot, and the textural element with the story itself, and on top of that, to have the music as a way to enhance what readers are able to get out of this story. And so when I think it was back in August or September, my friend Felix is a DJ and sound engineer, and so he has a background in music and sound production. And so I just messaged him and I was like, "Hey man, do you wanna do an album for my book?" Because he's one of the first people that saw the fungal verse come to fruition. He's he's known about it since the earliest days, and he and I have also collaborated in the past on sort of multimedia experiences. When he was living in Vancouver, I went back and we would do like, you know, live DJ and live tattooing in like a warehouse, parties and things like that. And so we have a history of collaborating with one another. And when I asked him this, he said, hell yes, 100% on board. And then he told me to wait, that he would get back to me the next day. And he sent me a screenshot from the notebook of a friend of his who's also a sound engineer and music producer. And the notebook just said, mycelium concept album was one of these notes that he put into his notebook. And so we just knew it was perfect. They started jamming and they sent me samples, and we narrowed it down to 8 tracks, and they were experimenting with different instruments and different forms of digital production. And it was just a beautiful experience to be able to work with them on this. And I'm so glad that we did, because now they have Spore, which is their production duo, and then they've also founded Fruiting Bodies. Sorry, MJ. Which is their record label, which they're launching with the Mushroom Blues soundtrack. And so they're going to release, we're going to collaborate on all of my future Fungal Verse books, and they're going to release stuff on their own. And they're also going to bring friends in to, collaborate with them or release solo EPs or albums or what have you.
Full mycelium network coming together. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, man.
The soundtrack is a very cool addition to the book. If anyone plans on reading it, you should. I recommend listening while you read.
Yeah.
Adds
It's
quite a bit.
also it's going to be available digitally on launch day, but also limited edition cassette tapes. And for anyone who reads Mushroom Blues, there are cassette tapes that play sort of like a role in parts of the story. So it's kind of this like meta thing that my friends came up with before I didn't even ask them. They were just like, we want to do cassettes. So
Love it. Here's a question from Jonathan in the audience. What part of the writing process do you find most difficult, and what comes easy for you? This is different for every author, so I'm keen to hear this.
The most difficult part for me is drafting. Drafting is like that very messy stage where things are just so uncertain, and that uncertainty is kind of like taxing after a while. Once you get to the middle of a book and you're like, I have no idea where this is fucking going. And even if you're an outliner or a plotter or what, or if you prefer to kind of pants it and wing it, getting to certain stages of the first draft is just it's a slog sometimes, because once you get to revision and editing, you're able to refine things based on this shit show of a draft that you had at the beginning. And revision is like, having having all the ingredients for a meal, and knowing that the ingredients are sound, and you can cook it even if you have to tweak a few things here and there. It's like having that recipe in front of your eyes and being able to tweak it and move it around and make it as good as it possibly can be is so much easier and more enjoyable than coming up with the recipe wholesale and trying to figure out, like, is this good? Like I was saying to you earlier, so many of the things about like Henrietta, her character, they came later. They came through revision. Something like so many things that are in the book never happened in the first draft. And so I love being able to really hone in on what's working about a story through revision. And it's been fun because Mushroom Blues is actually the first book that I've revised. It's not the first book I've written, but it's the first one I've revised. And I realize how beneficial that process can be.
Yeah, revision is critical. It's fascinating how different it is for everybody. I love first drafts and hate the rest of it. But we're all different. And there's a lot of ways to get to a wonderful book.
Exactly.
So Mushroom Blues is book one in a series, I'm
Hmm.
assuming, and I'm
Yep.
wondering, will future books in the series focus on the same characters with different cases, or are you moving into different characters? I mean, without giving too much spoilers,
Hmm.
how is the series going to progress moving forward?
So there are going to be 4 books in the Hoffman Report, um, and all of it is going to be about Koji and Henrietta's relationship. Um, Basically, like friendship in the making in a very shitty situation. And so each book is going to focus on a different case, but there's going to be overarching narratives that go from one book to the next. So it's not just like a simple case of the book type thing. And then on top of that, there are going to be multiple series within the Fungal verse. Um, the next book that I'm going to put out is Spore City, which is the first book in the Kanoko trilogy, which is set 30 years after the events in Mushroom Blues. That one's going to be much more about biotech and corrupt corporations and corporate espionage and gangster crime families and all this kind of stuff. But there are going to be characters that cross over, um, and I'm going to write both of those kind of back and forth concurrently. So release one from the Hoffman Report, and then Kanoko trilogy, and back and forth, and then start incorporating more stuff.
So here's a question from MJ. How many books had you written before? Were they mushroom based, and were they all SFF?
The book that I wrote before was Spore City, actually. So I wrote Spore City. So much of it isn't working. So I took a break from it and wrote Mushroom Blues, which started out as a novella that I was going to give away for free with a newsletter sign up. But then I realized I really love these characters and I'm going to make it a full novel. And then I realized, oh, I love these characters even more. I'm going to write a series. And so Mushroom Blues ended up becoming the sort of introduction to the fungal verse. And Spore City, I'll be reworking and fine tuning to the point where I can kick off the Kanoko trilogy with that one.
So, moving away from the book for just a second, most of our audience probably knows, but you do SFF Addicts podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you just start to do this? Tell us a little bit about it, in case people haven't heard of it. And what are the most rewarding aspects of meeting with so many different authors for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a bit selfish to start the podcast. I wanted to immerse myself more in the community, so I started writing for Fanfi Addict book blog, and then I realized like I really love to write fiction, but I don't always enjoy writing reviews and stuff like that. So, what are some other ways in which I can express myself and engage with the community? And podcasting is always something that I've loved. Like, I've listened to podcasts since, I think 2007 is when I listened to my first podcast. And back in those days, I was in high school. I was mostly listening to podcasts about video games, but it was cool to see like this burgeoning medium and how it's evolved over the years and what it is now is just insane. And so to be able to kind of infuse myself into that environment has been very cool and also a great way to kind of establish myself professionally, and meet a ton of authors, to be able to invite them on and pick their brains about writing craft and genre and marketing and all these different facets, publishing, that go into being an author. And so for me, a lot of it was based on these are the things that I'm curious about. These are the things that I want to learn about. And so that's going to become the topic for an episode. And I'm going to see who I can invite on. And what that ended up doing was, on one hand, I learned a ton. I'm still learning a ton. On the other hand, I've been able to give authors a platform, and indie authors are I feel very appreciative of that, especially, to be able to invite like Jonathan on with Adrian Tchaikovsky and J.S. Dewis to talk about space opera. You know, not only is it a fascinating conversation, but at the same time, I'm allowing these authors to engage with each other and meet each other, and I'm giving myself the opportunity to meet these authors. And a lot of the time, I've become acquaintances and sometimes legitimate friends, with so many amazing people in this community. And so for me, it's been like a lifeline to be able to have the support of, MJ, both of us being able to like support each other mutually through all the tough shit that goes on in life, and Jonathan too, Crystal Matar, Ronnie Verdi, so many amazing people who I've become very close to. And none of that would have been possible without the podcast. And so for me, it's a learning experience to be able to learn about writing, to be able to bring in, very talented people to discuss writing in its various forms. And at the same time, know that like just because someone is a New York Times bestseller or an award-winning author versus someone who is a debut author in indie, everyone has something valuable to bring to the table. And more often than not, they're all super cool people. And I've had the pleasure of becoming friends with a ton of them.
Well, thank you for what you do, because science fiction is a community, and we all know how difficult the book world can be.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to stick our necks out for each other and help out.
Especially publishing. Like I feel like we can bond over the joys of writing and the frustrations of publishing.
Absolutely. No writer that's doing it is a stranger to these things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your insights. Before we go, you mentioned a couple ongoing series, but what else is
Mm-hmm.
next for you? What's coming up, and what are you working on currently?
Yeah, so Mushroom Blues is out on the 19th in paperback and ebook. Hardcover is out on April 2nd, and then audiobook, which I myself am narrating, is out on April 16th. Other than that, you can catch new episodes of SFF Addicts every Tuesday, with author interviews and master classes with MJ and I. And currently I'm working on novella for newsletter novella. Let's see where this goes. Maybe I'll just write a whole freaking series about this thing. No, this one is very much like planned out, hoping to get it out in April. But it's a sort of spin-off of Mushroom Blues. So it's kind of like a character that appears in Mushroom Blues appears in this novella, novelette, whatever it ends up being. And then after that, yeah, I'll be diving back into Spore City to get that polished up and hopefully released in the fall.
Wonderful. Lots to look forward to. Adrian M. Gibson, Mushroom Blues. If you're here now in the chat, there's links for pre-order for all of that. If you're watching on YouTube, you will find those below the video. Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you to our audience for being here tonight. Wonderful to finally meet you in semi person. You're doing great work. Keep it up, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, and thank you everybody for watching.